When we talk about the Founding Fathers, we often imagine them frozen in time, etched into statues, or signing important papers by candlelight. But the real story is much more complex and much more human. These were individuals with different backgrounds, conflicting opinions, and imperfect records. Yet together they built something revolutionary, a new kind of country. They weren't all best friends, and they certainly didn't agree on everything. Some were wealthy plantation owners. Others were lawyers, farmers, soldiers, or inventors. Many were slave owners. Some spoke out against slavery. But what they shared was a vision for a society not ruled by kings and not entirely dictated by religion or aristocracy. What makes their story so compelling is how much of it still applies to the world we live in today. The political debates we have, the freedoms we enjoy, and even the flaws we're still trying to fix. They all trace back to these early years. Who they were. So who exactly were the Founding Fathers? There's no official list, but the most well-known names include George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams, and John Jay. These men played the biggest roles in creating the documents, systems, and ideas that would define the United States. George Washington, for example, wasn't just the first president. He was the general who led American forces to victory in the Revolutionary War. He could have held on to power for life. Some even wanted him to be king. But he famously stepped down after 2 terms, setting the standard for future presidents. Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. He had a poetic way with words, writing that all men are created equal, even though he owned slaves himself. That contradiction has become one of the biggest historical debates around him today. Benjamin Franklin is one of the most unique characters in American history. He wasn't just a statesman, he was an inventor, a writer, a diplomat, and even a humorist. He helped secure France's support during the Revolutionary War, which was a game changer for the American cause. Then there's Alexander Hamilton, who's had a resurgence in popularity thanks to the Broadway musical. He was born in the Caribbean, came from nothing, and rose to become the first Secretary of the Treasury. His financial systems helped stabilize the new economy, but he also clashed hard with Jefferson and others who feared a powerful central government. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution for his central role in drafting it and arguing for its ratification. He also helped write the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that protect things like free speech and due process. John Adams, meanwhile, was a fiery advocate for independence. He had a rocky presidency, but he helped set the legal foundation for the U.S. He was also one of the few Founding Fathers who never owned slaves and strongly opposed the institution. John Jay might be less famous, but he was just as important. He co-wrote the Federalist Papers and served as the first Chief Justice of the United States. What they did. The Founding Fathers didn't just fight a war. They laid the intellectual and legal foundation. They declared independence from Britain. That might seem obvious today, but back then, it was a huge risk. The British Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the world. Declaring independence meant open rebellion, and many of the signers were essentially putting their lives on the line. The war lasted 8 long years. Supplies were short. Funding was a constant problem. Washington's troops often went unpaid, but through alliances, especially with France, and some key victories, the colonists eventually won. But winning the war was just the first step. The real challenge came afterward. What kind of government would replace the monarchy? How would power be divided? Who gets to vote? Who's counted as a citizen? At first, they created the Articles of Confederation, a system that gave most of the power to the individual states and almost none to the national government. It didn't work. The federal government couldn't even collect taxes or regulate trade between states. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia to try again. What came out of that meeting was the United States Constitution. This new document created a balance of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It set rules for how laws would be made, how the president would be chosen, and how states would interact with one another. But the Constitution wasn't perfect, and the debates over it were intense. Some feared it gave too much power to the federal government. Others worried it didn't protect individual rights. That's where the Bill of Rights came in. 10 amendments that guaranteed freedoms like speech, religion, and protection from unreasonable searches. Contradictions and controversies. Now, it's important to be honest. The Founding Fathers were not flawless. Many owned slaves, even while writing about liberty and equality. Women were excluded from political participation. Native American lands were taken with little regard, and poor white men without property often had no vote. These contradictions have led to modern re-examinations of the Founders' legacy. How can someone fight for freedom while denying it to others? It's a question we're still grappling with today. Yet many historians argue that the ideas they put in motion, ideas about liberty, representation, checks on power, have outgrown the men who wrote them. Over time, movements for abolition, women's rights, civil rights, and more have used those founding principles to push for a more inclusive society. Their legacy today. So what does all this mean for us today? The system the Founding Fathers created has lasted more than 230 years. That's rare in world history. It's been tested by wars, protests, corruption, and technological change, but it's still here. Their model of government, 3 branches, checks and balances, regular elections, has inspired countries around the world. At the same time, we continue to debate some of the same issues they faced. How much power should the federal government have? How do we balance individual freedoms with the needs of society? What does equality actually mean? Even the Electoral College, which was designed in part to give smaller states a voice, is now a source of controversy. The Second Amendment, written at a time of militias and muskets, is now at the center of modern gun debates. And the First Amendment is constantly tested in the age of social media and online speech. That's part of what makes their work so remarkable. It wasn't static, it was meant to adapt. The Constitution includes a process for amendments, and while it's not easy to change, it's possible. Conclusion. The Founding Fathers were visionaries, yes, but they were also just people. Some were brilliant, some were flawed, some were both. They didn't create a perfect country, but they created a framework that allowed future generations to fight for a better one. And maybe that's the most important part of their legacy. They gave us not just freedom, but the tools to make that freedom real for more and more people over time. So the next time you hear about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, don't just think of the statues or the textbook quotes. Think of the choices they made, the risks they took, the ideas they believed in, ideas we're still arguing about, still fighting for, and still trying to fully live up to today.